Hello and welcome back once again to yet another review. You guys remember how last year I did a 10cc video that absolutely no one actually watched? Well, that's too bad because the next few weeks are going to be a 10cc marathon for reasons that will become very clear around the middle of April. Basically, it ties into the fact that the last video took 3 weeks to make. I thought I had more time to do a certain project that, again, will come out in the middle of April, but turns out that I don't, so we're doing all of the 10cc albums up to 1976. And today, it's the sophomore 10cc record, Sheet Music from 1974. This is a really interesting album. It might actually be the most interesting of the four Godley Creme era 10cc records, mostly because it's the one that points forward the most to what would eventually happen after 1976. Again, spoilers for what's to come. There came a point where the double duo songwriter arrangement that prevailed in early 10cc stopped working, and there was a not entirely acrimonious but not exactly amicable either split between the two camps. This album is interesting because it sounds the most like what the majority of solo Godley Creme was going to sound like. Just got hooks, it's very clearly pop, but it's on a very different and less accessible level than the rest of 10cc. You know, the first album is much more of a pop record. The last two albums are much more sort of 70s art rock and art pop affairs. This is out in its own corner. I'm led to believe, for a lot of 10cc fans, like, this is the one. This is the album that they put up on the pedestal and they say, this is the band firing on all cylinders. You know, it's the peak of their powers. They could do no wrong here. It's the best one. I'm not entirely sure I agree, but it's definitely a view I'm sympathetic to. So just as a side note, I don't know if people still care about this stuff as much as they once did. I suspect if I get hate in this video, it'll be because I even mentioned this, but anyway. 10cc, you know, they're a band that have a sense of humor. I've often described that sense of humor as being sort of somewhere between the Beatles and Steely Dan, where they're mean-spirited, and a lot of their songs are about, like, nasty characters, but they're not as nihilistic, I guess, as Steely Dan were. They're not as mean as Zappa could get. Anyway, the reason I'm bringing any of this up is that this is probably the most problematic 10cc album, at least of the original four. There are some lyrics on this album, and the next one, now that I think of it, that you probably could not do today without getting yourself in some hot water. But anyway, I think I've talked about that enough. Ironically, you know, it's interesting, the first two 10cc albums are very much of a part, and then the third and fourth albums are also very much have similar production sound. And if you want to know more about that and just about the history of 10cc and Godley Creme as well, there's this great podcast called Consequences that talks a lot about them, and it's really something you should check out if you like this band and you're interested in podcasts at all. But with that exhortation to close this video and go listen to a much better podcast, let's talk about the tracks. So track one week and one outfit later, I apologize, but the boys were having furious discourse about the relative merits of video criticism, and, you know, I felt the need to defend my honor. Wall Street Shuffle is a relatively straightforward track. There's some cool hooks, some sneering wit about industry, and invocation of Howard Hughes. This fits into the theme of the song, also fits into this broader old Hollywood theme that pops up 3 or 4 times on this album. Working on it. Worst Band in the World is one of the most singular things to have come out of the 70s. It is strangely amorphous for something that has as many catchy moving parts as it does. This era of 10cc, these first two albums, are very much like sort of the return of the son of Smile-era Beach Boys, in that these songs, they're very modular. There's a lot of moving parts in them, and this is one of the more extreme but also reductive cases, because there really is only one recurring bit to the song, and it is that guitar riff and sort of bass thing that continues throughout. It's just a succession of hooks that don't necessarily connect to each other, strung together, telling a story about a horrible, awful 70s rock band and just how terrible and miserable they are. Hotel is another standout of this album. It has this sort of odd structure, but at the same time is much more conventional than Worst Band in the World. From the weird ambient opening with its sort of dodgy island accent falsetto bit, to the little modules of hooks and catchiness that pop in and out of the song, not always seeming to connect to things like the Yankee Go Home bit. I really enjoy that. Anyway, it's a very fun track. There is a little bit of dodginess to it, but I want to talk a little bit more in depth about that sort of thing later on. So something that I did not mention in my introduction that I probably should have mentioned about the structure of this album and the relative, out there-ness of it is that much more than the first 10cc album, Sheet Music veers wildly between sort of modular, extremely creative, sort of, like I said, Return of the Son of Smiley or a Beach Boys stuff, and what 10cc would become on the next two albums after this, which I will describe in greater depth as we move along, but the simplest way I know how to explain it is that the end point for 10cc before they sort of start to decline after Deceptive Bends is more inventive ELO levels of songwriting, but again, I'll discuss that when I get to Deceptive Bends. Anyway, this is a very fun track. It's a sort of atmospheric, wistful piece about the old men of rock and roll, those forgotten heroes of the 1950s. And it's very well done, but it's also very, very funny. There's a genre of rock song from the 70s and 80s that is, it's talking about these old rock and rollers, who are like 40 and 50 years old, and discussing them as though they are these, ancient beings who have outlived their natural lifespans by several centuries and just sit shriveled and wizened, unable to process or identify with the modern world. And there's probably something there about the baby boomers being the first generation to grow up under the sort of very extreme fetishization of youth that is fostered by sort of post-Second World War Western consumer capitalism. But I leave that sort of analysis to significantly smarter people and merely acknowledge that this is a very good song. Clockwork Creep is yet another phenomenal song. Lyrically, it is about one of the recurring fascinations of 10cc and Godley Creme, which two different 10cc songs about airplane crashes, and then it's somewhat of a recurring theme. Musically, it's very interesting. It's fast-paced. I would compare this a little bit to Hotel in the sense that it does have a bit more of a pop structure, but within that pop structure, there's a lot of very interesting things going on. Like a lot of Godley Creme stuff, it's very visual. You almost imagine some of the parts, the subsets of the song as almost like theatrical performances. You like it a lot. It's a real highlight of the album, and much better than any song that has its lyrical conceit of being about an anthropomorphic bomb in the bowels of an airplane has any right to be. Now that I think about it, it reminds me a little bit of Sparks in that sense of taking a concept that is kind of dumb, doing it so well that you forget how dumb the idea of the song is. But between you and me, I think it's... With the exception of How Dare You, every one of the first four 10cc albums has its Eric Stewart centric, barn burning, having a rave up track, and this is this album's version of it. It is the most straightforward thing on here by a fairly long shot. It's not a bad song. I especially like the vocal melodies and the guitar bits. You know, there's a very particular guitar sound on these first two albums. They never really had again that I really like, but other than that, I really don't have much to say about it. It's good. Somewhere in Hollywood is, in many respects, the centerpiece of this album, and in some respects, the most perfect product of the entire first era of 10cc. I don't know if I personally hold that opinion, but it's certainly not one I'll disagree with too much. This track, I think, is very much the most sort of Beach Boys plus of this album, but again, the very specific Smile and Smile Sessions era, and the little bits of that stuff that drifted out to the broader world during the first half of the 70s. In this case, I think the really obvious comparison is Surf's Up. I think it's a little bit more satisfyingly one thing than the version of Surf's Up that we did eventually get, probably because it was composed in one piece as opposed to being assembled the way that Surf's Up was assembled in the early 70s, which is something I will leave to be discussed at some undecided future point in time when I finally get around to talking about the Beach Boys again. But suffice to say, this is a phenomenal track. It continues in probably the most extreme sense that sort of all old Hollywood theme that pervades quite a few tracks on this album, and to a certain extent, a lot of Godley Creme and 10cc stuff. And yeah, honestly, I don't have that much else to say about it. It's a phenomenal track, probably the best on this album by a long shot, and you should listen to it yourself today. I don't want to make too big of a point out of this because there's a point in the future history of 10cc that I will eventually get around to talking about that I think merits this discussion more. It is an interesting track. I think musically it is good, and in terms of vocal melodies it's good. It is a bit dodgy in some ways. Again, I'll flesh this out in a more thorough form later on, but there's a running thread throughout 10cc of sort of dodgy takes on sort of Caribbean genres and vocals, and it's something I'm not necessarily equipped to talk about in any real depth, so I'm not going to here, but nonetheless I feel like I probably should acknowledge it. I've always really enjoyed this track, maybe a little bit more than I should, considering it is by no means the best 10cc song, but it's very fun. It's making fun of, dance songs and drunkenness and so forth, and that's really all there is to it. It's just a fun, well put together, catchy little song. Never saw the guns in the whiskey cases. And so we end the album with Oh Effendi, which curiously is the one that the liner notes to this album single out as being the least politically correct of the tracks on this album, which I see, but I also don't see at the same time. Maybe it's an American British thing. Maybe it's also the era when this reissue was put out. But, this is one of those 10cc songs where you could read it as dodgy. It's a track about a ridiculous character arms dealing to Arab revolutionaries in the Middle East. And it's very tongue-in-cheek, but it's one of those 10cc songs that could be read as dodgy, and I think there's an argument to be made it is dodgy, but at the same time, most of the mocking in the song is focused very heavily on the arms dealer character, and less so on the people he's selling this stuff to. But anyway, I'm definitely overthinking this. It has a great riff, the vocal melodies are good, and I really like the Lol Cream falsetto vocals throughout. It's a very strong closing track for the album. Sheet music is a fascinating record. I mentioned in the intro this is a lot of fans' favorite one. You know, it's very much of the first 5. It is the fan favorite. It's the one that the band themselves, I believe, have singled out and said this is the one where we were working at the peak of our form. And I can see that point. You know, it's a very, very good album. And in some respects is perhaps their most creative release. However, it's one that I've never been quite as into as I'm supposed to be as somebody who is a massive 10cc fan. It has those great songs, and you know, some of the best in the catalog are on here. You know, Somewhere in Hollywood, Clockwork Creep, Hotel, you know, Worst Band in the World, just track after track after track. But somehow, of the first 4, it's the one I listen to the least in full. To be completely honest with you, you could even extend that. It's probably the one of the first 5 I listen to the least, which is really interesting, because I think if I ranked the 10cc albums, Deceptive Bends would be below this album. But I put on Deceptive Bends all the time, and this one doesn't get quite as much attention from me, and I'm not really 100% sure why that is. Something that you'll see in future videos as I move along sort of at warp speed to try to catch up with the fact that this video and the last 2 before it took a lot longer for me to make than I thought they would, is that there's very much 2 halves of Godley Creme era 10cc. There's the first 2 albums, which are a kind of avant bubblegum of the early 70s, very much sort of 72, 73, 74, that kind of, you know, British chart music of that era in all of its eclecticism and weirdness, and how could this have been popular? And then the last 2 albums, and then the fifth album that Stewart and Goldman did themselves after Godley Creme left to do Consequences, are very much sort of, you know, heavily pop in the Beatles mold inflected 70s album-oriented art rock. That's very much what the next 3 albums are. And then Consequences is a monument to the fact that the 70s were absolutely just out of their mind. Like, how on earth an album like that got made is something that I will be exploring this April. Perhaps not, in fact, in time for April 17th, but, you know, occupying the entire month and being acknowledged by April 17th. But yeah, this album, it's an interesting one. Like I said, it's not an album I return to as much as I probably should. But this album, you know, is a very, very interesting one. Like I said, it's not a record I return to as much as I should, but it is nonetheless an extremely strong album. And if you've never heard it and you're a fan of these guys at all, I would very, very strongly advise you to check it out immediately. Till next time, I have been a person chronically incapable of putting out more than 1 video in a month. I will see you all later.